Morning. Morning. You can help me up the stairs here. Thank you. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. You can get this old crip in here. I wouldn't have minded if I'd won the tennis match. Oh.
Well, I really don't need to introduce this gentleman. I think you know, every one of you knows who he is. You will be graduates of a school that will bear his name. And wherever you go in this country, and your transcript and your resume says the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Telecommunication, it's going to open a lot of doors for you. Because everyone in the second half of the 20th century who knows anything about journalism knows what the name Walter Cronkite means to this profession and what it symbolizes. I can remember when I was your age and just getting into broadcasting and aspiring to be Walter Cronkite, the man of my generation that everybody looked to for guidance, for a symbol of what journalism stands for. So it's a very important event in this school to have him here today. As he said, he was playing tennis and tore his Achilles tendon. And so he's making a special effort to get over here and be with us today. He's going to be at the school all day. This is the major event where you can ask him questions and learn more about what he's all about, what he's meant for this school, and his attitudes about the issues of the day. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Walter Cronkite.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. Thank you all. If you keep applauding like that, I may run for president. Everybody can, apparently. I really want to do mostly question and answers today. I have no lecture to deliver to you. My thoughts on journalism today, I will summarize quickly for you to give you some small guidance as to the way I think. I felt that I was lucky enough to come into journalism through the written press first, and then, if you please, graduate or slip, depending upon how you look at it, into broadcast journalism. I was a University of Texas product. Don't boo. It's a reasonably good school. It's not nearly as good naturally as the Walter Cronkite School of Communications, but thanks to the wonderful staff we have here, actually it is a good school. But I worked my way through or into the university practically. I had the great good fortune to be a student in a high school that had a journalism course. That was very unusual in my day. It's not so unusual any longer, but in my day, and I'm talking about high school a long time ago, in the late 1920s, I was in high school, graduated from high school in 1933. And San Jacinto High School in Houston, Texas, was one of the very few high schools in the United States that had a journalism course at all. And that was because a very dedicated former editor of one of our newspapers in Houston felt convinced that there should be journalism classes in high school and donated his time, an hour a week, to each of the 5 high schools in Houston, and I was lucky enough to enroll in his course. He was an inspiring teacher, and when teachers are inspiring, and most of them hope to be, and many of them are, they can have a powerful effect upon our future. He certainly did. Fred Burney, I followed around like a puppy dog. I was so intrigued with all that he told us about the great advantages of being a journalist. So I edited my high school newspaper under Fred Burney, sports editor and assistant editor of the Annual, and then went on to the University of Texas. But before I got to the University of Texas, I already was working the last couple of summers in high school as a copy boy at the one of the Houston papers, the Houston Post. And when I went to the university, I was the Houston Post Capital University correspondent, which meant space rates. Space rates in newspapers in those days were you know, they're not much of that anymore, but space rates in those days meant that whatever you filed to them, whatever you sent to them that they used, they paid you by the inch of the copy in the newspaper. And I think as I remember, the pay was very good. It was 25 cents an inch. So of course this didn't inspire being very short with your copy. In fact, it was just the opposite. It was a bad inspiration in forcing you to write longer copy. Of course, the editorial desk at the newspaper took care of that and whittled you down to a couple of dollars for an article. But then I got a job at the state capitol, working for the new INS Bureau then, International News Service, which later merged with the United Press for UPI, United Press International. I moved from that to the Scripps Howard newspapers of Texas. There were 3. And they had a state capitol bureau, so I got to cover politics in my very early days while I was still just a sophomore in college. Moved from that on down to the Houston Press and then the United Press. Did a little radio work in between because I found radio rather intriguing, but I wasn't terribly impressed, quite honestly, with the integrity, if you please, of radio news reporting back there in the mid-30s. You got to understand that was a long time. Well, you do understand it was a long time ago, probably before your parents were born. And in those days, radio was fairly new. It had only been in, when I was first doing it, it had been popular, in fact available for only 11 years. 1922 was the first major national radio broadcast. This was 1933. And what I found in those days, and it was true, that most radio news was very poorly done. It was done by ex-announcers without journalism experience, and they just took the local newspaper and read from the newspaper a few items. That was what radio news consisted of for the most part. It was to develop, of course, quite considerably after that, prompted by World War II, when there was some real original reporting, and that led by the great Edward R. Murrow, who incidentally, and this may shock you as forthcoming would-be journalists, but Edward R. Murrow, one of the greatest of the radio newsmen, newspersons, had no journalism training whatsoever. Ed Murrow went to London before the war as a representative of CBS to enroll academicians, for the most part, teachers, professors, but other intellectuals in a series of lectures on radio to be carried by CBS in the United States. And he happened to be there, of course, when the war started, and William S. Paley, the head of CBS, cabled him, possibly telephoned him, although that was difficult in those days, probably cabled him and said, "Since you're there, cover the war." And Ed Murrow did, and turned out to be a natural at it, and learned his journalism the hard way, right at the feet of one of the greatest stories of all time. Did a great job at it. This does not suggest that journalism training in college is not a very good idea. Today it's essential, really, to break into journalism, to have this background that you're getting at ASU in the ethics of journalism, in the techniques of journalism, whether print or broadcast, and in the primary function of both of those outlets, broadcast and print, and that is writing. If this is my philosophy, and I'm sure it's repeated by many of your professors and teachers, that the core of all journalism is two things: the ability to report, or let's say three things: ability to report, the ability to write what you have found out about the story you want, and of course then that extra ability to edit your own and other people's copy. Behind that lies the ethics of journalism, which you're learning here, which is also essential to the craft. Without ethics, we really are not, should not call ourselves fulfilled journalists. It can't be done unless we understand that truth, honesty, fairness in all things is essential of what we're trying to do as journalists. Having thus spoken from the throne here this morning, let's do some questions. So I suppose raising hands or shouting out or standing up and waving a banner, something of that kind will get you attention.
One on either side, please.
Yes,
Excuse me, can we turn the volume of that up? I'm a little bit hard of hearing. That's not true at all. I'm deaf as a post is what I am. Speak up.
Is that better? Is that better then?
Yes, I'm going to have, will you repeat the question for me?
Okay. I was wondering what, if anything, you think that the media should change about the way that they are covering presidential elections, especially ones like this year where it's so close and there were these early calls about who was the victor in Florida.
So how should the media change its coverage of presidential elections?
How should it change it?
Yeah.
The question, how should media change its coverage of elections? Well, I think the first thing we have to look at is the exit polling on election day. As far as campaign coverage goes, I think the media, and that's both broadcast and print, did a fine job. The campaigns were well covered. I thought they were covered with very few exceptions, with great fairness, great honesty, on both the broadcast and print. The failure began with exit polling. Exit polling, as you all know, is the polling that is done now by a service, the Election News Service, which is a pooled service of nearly all of the media. That is, of the principal newspapers, the News Service, Associated Press, and the broadcast networks, with a couple of the cable networks thrown in, cable stations thrown in. The process is for for pollsters at selected precincts in selected states, the important states, in all the states actually, selected precincts where pollsters talk to the people who have just voted as they leave the voting place, and ask them how they voted and why. The service is very valuable for the second reason, why particularly. It, for the first time, has given our nation a read on what were the influences that caused people to vote the way they did, which gives us a marvelous profile of our electorate and what concerns that electorate. The second aspect of the polling is, of course, to be able to predict early in the evening, almost immediately after polls close, unless they are too close, predict how that state will vote, who will win in the state, who will get the state's electoral votes. That is where we came a cropper this year. This system of exit polling is about 20 years old, I guess. Five, maybe more than that, 6 of our elections. Well, when I covered the elections for CBS, was the anchor person and the managing editor of our election coverage. We started in 1952 with our own polling of precincts on a slightly different basis. It was not exit polling at all, but it was based on the old rule of thumb, which all politicians used in every state. There were certain precincts, certain areas, certain congressional districts that historically gave a clue to how the entire state would go. The few precincts gave the clue. Those precincts through historically had gone one way or the other with a certain percentage of votes. I'll just take one of the real old rules of thumb, which every politician knew, was Cuyahoga County, Ohio, Cleveland, the Cleveland area. The Democrats had to come out of Cleveland with about a 4-to-1 margin over the Republicans if they were going to win Ohio. If they came out with less than that number of votes of some selected precincts in Cuyahoga County, they knew that Democrats and the Republicans knew that the Republicans would win Ohio, not the Democrats. There were similar precincts all around the country. And those precincts, we got the results as soon as the polls closed, not sooner. As soon as the polls closed, we got those results, fed them into our computers, and came up with a result for that state. And we were able to draw a national picture, therefore, of who was winning and who was losing. Now this and any other kind of polling works as long as the election is not as close as the election of the year 2000, which we've just seen. That is too close to call, and yet the media attempted to call the race. We did all right with the exception of Florida, which turned out to be, of course, the key state because it was so close, closer than any of the others, and it had that big block of 25 electoral votes. So the media has learned a lesson, have learned a lesson, I should say. The media have learned a lesson that when a vote is that close, that system shouldn't be used to call an election. And I'm sure, we know, CBS has appointed a committee to look into what we do next time, what went wrong, what we do this next time. Every other responsible medium has done so. Together they will come together, since they together run the Election News Service. It is a pooled effort. Something will change, I'm sure. The main thing that would change, if nothing else changes, is that the margin of error has to be increased so that elections are not called on the basis of a very close return from the election service. And as a matter of fact, this year the election service did not call Florida for Gore, and it did not call the state then later for Bush, as happened. What happened there is the Fox service first called Gore and then called for Bush, and the other news services, the other networks, all panicked, as did some of the newspapers. They panicked because here was Fox ahead of them. They couldn't believe it, but they went ahead and panicked and said, well, if they think it's close enough, perhaps we should think it's close enough. Each of the networks and the newspapers have their own, the major newspapers do, and the AP certainly, have their own analysis service. That is, the 3 or 4 people who are the election desk. They're the people who decide whether to call a state or not. They are skilled pollsters, skilled political pollsters. They know how to balance these things and these selected precincts. Nearly all of us still have our selected precincts that we back up against the Election News Service. And we called 49 states correctly, apparently. The close ones like Arizona and a couple others we didn't call for a long time. And still what we have called has stood up in all of those states so far. So it's just the one big mistake that of course has created what we now are living with. And I might add just an opinion here that I'm afraid that the television press, particularly television reports, are a little hysterical right now about our problem in selecting, in deciding how Florida is going to go. This is not a crisis in this country as they're making it out to be at all. We've got plenty of time to decide this thing. It's proper, I think, that we should go to the courts. I don't think that's a bad thing to go to the court. That the rule of law is the way we run our country. It's the reason why America has been so successful in 200 and something years of our existence, 225 years, almost. It's the rule of law. We believe in the rule of law. We do not believe that rebel groups or revolutionary groups should take over in a state of some disturbance. We go to the courts. So I think that's all right that we should. We'll know later this afternoon, of course, just what the fate of Florida will be and the fate of the two presidential candidates. But I do not expect that to be the end of it. It's very likely this thing will go to the Supreme Court. And even then, that may not be the end of it. The state legislature of Florida has to decide on who their electors are eventually, who they send to Washington as their electors. And indeed, the Congress of the United States can accept or turn down, believe it or not, the electors they send. So